The doors of the chapel had been open for 11 minutes, and the bride still had not walked through them. I stood at the side of the hall with a tray of champagne glasses in my hands, watching the man in the wheelchair at the end of the aisle. His name was Damien Cross, and every person in that room, from the senators pretending to be businessmen to the bodyguards pretending to be waiters, knew that he was not a man who waited. Yet there he sat, spine straight, hands folded over the blanket across his knees, staring at the empty doorway, as if he could force her to appear through sheer will. I had worked in his house for 2 years. I knew the difference between his calm and his control. This was control, the kind that costs a person everything to hold. The string quartet kept playing the same soft entrance music on a loop, because no one had told them to stop, and no one dared walk up to the front of the room to tell Damien that his bride was not coming. I watched his jaw tighten with every repeated note. 200 guests sat in silence that grew heavier by the second, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on your shoulders and makes you want to run. A man near the front stood up first. Victor Hale, the head of the Western Division of the family business, straightened his jacket and looked toward the doors with an expression I could not read. He was Damien's uncle by marriage, though nobody used soft words like uncle in that house. He walked to Damien's side and bent down to whisper something. Damien did not turn his head. He simply raised one hand, a small motion, and Victor stepped back like he had touched something hot. I should not have been watching this closely. My job was to keep the champagne moving and stay out of sight, the way good staff always does. But something about the stillness in Damien's shoulders made it impossible to look away. 10 more minutes passed. Then a young woman ran in through the side door, her face pale, a phone shaking in her hand. She was Camille's cousin, one of the bridesmaids, and she did not bother lowering her voice. "She's gone," the woman said. "Her room is empty. Her dress is still hanging in the closet. Her phone is off." The words moved through the chapel like a current through water. Chairs creaked. Someone gasped. A man in a dark suit near the back stood and walked out quickly, already speaking into a small device clipped to his collar. I saw 2 more men do the same, moving toward exits, their calm faces replaced by something sharper. Damien did not move at all. That was the part that frightened me most. Not the running, not the whispering, not the sudden chaos spreading through 200 wealthy guests who had come expecting cake and champagne and were now watching a criminal empire's careful public image collapse in real time. It was the way Damien sat perfectly still in his wheelchair at the front of that grand hall, alone, while everyone around him reacted and scattered and panicked. He had learned, a long time ago, that stillness was the only kind of power left to him. I set my tray down on the nearest table because my hands had started to shake, and I did not want to be the maid who dropped 24 champagne glasses in front of the Cross family and their guests. Around me, people began leaving in small groups, murmuring behind gloved hands, some already reaching for their phones to spread the story before they had even left the parking lot. I watched an older woman in a wide hat lean toward her husband and say, loud enough for half the room to hear, that she always knew a man like that could never really keep a woman. I felt my face grow hot with anger on Damien's behalf, which surprised me, because I had never allowed myself to feel much of anything about my employer, beyond the quiet respect you give someone who signs your paycheck and mostly leaves you alone. Within 20 minutes, the chapel had nearly emptied. The security team had fanned out through the estate, checking cameras, questioning drivers, calling contacts. Somewhere in another wing of the house, I imagined that phones were ringing off their hooks, that men in dark suits were trying to decide whether this was an embarrassment, a betrayal, or the opening move in something far more dangerous. I stayed behind because someone had to clear the hall, and because the household staff had been trained never to leave a mess in a room that belonged to the family. I began stacking chairs near the back, trying to keep my hands busy, trying not to look toward the front of the room where Damien still sat. When I finally glanced up, most of the family and staff had gone. The great chapel, built with imported stone and towering windows that let in the late afternoon light, held only 2 people, him and me. He had not moved his wheelchair an inch. The white flowers along the altar were beginning to wilt in the warm air, petals dropping quietly onto the marble floor. The band had finally stopped playing, though I had not noticed exactly when. In the silence, I could hear his breathing, slow and controlled, like a man trying very hard not to let anyone hear anything else underneath it. I should have left. Every instinct trained into me over 2 years of service told me to slip out quietly through the side door and let him have this moment alone, the way you would give any grieving man his privacy. But my feet did not move toward the exit. Instead, without deciding to, I found myself walking down the long aisle toward him, past rows of abandoned chairs and dropped flowers, past a fallen veil that no one had bothered to pick up. He heard my footsteps and turned his head, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his face that was not guarded. It was raw, and tired, and furious, and underneath all of it, something that looked almost like shame. "You should go home, Elena," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the way voices do in empty stone rooms. "There is nothing left to serve here." "I'm not here to serve," I said, and I was as surprised by my own words as he seemed to be. He studied me for a long moment. I was aware, suddenly, of everything about myself that people like his family usually overlooked. I was not thin, and I was not born into money, and I had never once been mistaken for anyone important in that house. I cleaned dishes and pressed linens and carried trays, and most of the guests who had just left this room would not have been able to describe my face if asked. But right now, in this ruined chapel, none of that seemed to matter. "Then why are you here?" he asked. I looked at the long empty aisle behind me, at the wilted flowers, at the chairs still arranged for a ceremony that would never happen. I thought about all the guests who had just walked out shaking their heads, already writing the story they would tell at dinner parties for years. I thought about how alone one person can be in a room built to hold 200 witnesses to his happiness. "Because everyone else left," I said, "and I don't think you should be the only person in this room today." He let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "There's nothing you can do about any of this." "I'm not trying to fix anything," I said. "I'm only trying to keep you company for a minute." He looked at me the way people look at something they do not understand, and I realized he was not used to anyone offering him something without wanting a favor returned. Every person who had walked through those doors today had wanted something from Damien Cross, an alliance, a business deal, a photograph for their social pages. I wanted nothing. The silence stretched between us, but it felt different now, less crushing. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of cars pulling away down the long gravel driveway, engines fading into the distance one by one. I thought about the wheelchair, about the years he had spent learning to run an empire from a body that no longer obeyed him the way it used to. I thought about how much courage it must have taken to sit through those first empty minutes without letting his face crack in front of 200 strangers. And then, before I could talk myself out of it, I asked the question that would change everything that came after. "Would you like to dance?" He blinked, and for a moment, I thought he might have me removed from the property for the sheer absurdity of the offer. A man in a wheelchair, alone in the ruins of his own wedding, being asked to dance by the household maid. But then something shifted behind his eyes. Not hope, not yet. Something smaller than hope, curiosity maybe, or the smallest crack in the wall he had built around himself over years of learning not to need anyone. "Nobody has ever asked me that before," he said quietly. "Not once, in 8 years. "Then I suppose it's about time somebody did," I said, and I held out my hand. He looked at my hand for a long moment, as though it were a puzzle he had not expected to face today. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the same sharp mind that ran a business empire trying to work out whether this was pity, or mockery, or something else entirely. I kept my hand steady and waited, because I understood that if I let it waver even slightly, he would read it as doubt, and doubt was the one thing he could not accept from anyone. "I can't dance the way other men can," he said finally. "You understand that." "I never asked you to dance the way other men do," I said. "I asked if you would like to dance. Those are different questions." Something in his face loosened, just barely at the edges. He reached up and placed his hand in mine, and his grip was firmer than I expected, the hand of a man who had spent years learning to compensate for what his legs could no longer do. I released the brake on his wheelchair, and for a moment neither of us moved, both of us simply standing at the threshold of something neither of us had a name for yet. "The band is gone," he said, Then we'll have to imagine the music, I answered, and I began to hum, quietly at first, an old, simple tune that my mother used to sing while she worked, and I guided the wheelchair in a slow, gentle turn beneath the wilting flowers, past the abandoned chairs, down the long aisle where a bride was supposed to have walked toward him only an hour before. He did not speak for a while. I watched the tension in his shoulders ease, just slightly, with each turn we made across the marble floor. The late afternoon light through the tall windows had shifted to a deep gold, and it caught the edges of the flowers, the dust in the air, the two of us moving slowly through a room that had been built for a celebration, and had instead become something quieter, something more honest. "Why did you really do this?" he asked, when we finally came to a stop near the altar. I thought about lying, about giving him some polished answer about duty or kindness. Instead, I told him the truth. Because I have spent 2 years in this house, watching everyone treat you like a business arrangement instead of a person, and today, of all days, I could not bear to see you sit alone. He looked at me for a long time after that, and I felt, for the first time since I had walked into that chapel, that Damien Cross was truly seeing me, not the maid who cleared his dishes, not a uniform moving quietly through his house, but a person standing in front of him. "Thank you, Elena," he said quietly. And outside, far down the gravel drive, I heard the last of the guests' cars disappear into the evening. A folded note was waiting on my pillow when I returned to the staff quarters that night, and my hands went cold before I even opened it. There was no name on it, no signature, only 6 words written in narrow, careful handwriting. She did not leave alone. I read those words 3 times, my heart pounding, before I understood that someone in that house had wanted me, specifically, to find this note, and that whoever had left it knew things about Camille's disappearance that the rest of the estate did not. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed with the note pressed flat under my pillow, listening to the distant sound of cars still arriving and leaving the estate long after midnight, security teams working through the darkness, searching, questioning, tightening their grip on a house that suddenly felt far less safe than it had that morning. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I was going to show Damien the note myself, rather than pass it along through the household manager the way protocol required. I told myself it was because I did not trust anyone else to take it seriously. If I am honest, it was also because some part of me wanted an excuse to see him again. I found him in the East Wing study a little after 7, still in the same dark suit from the wedding, though the jacket had been removed and the collar of his shirt was open. He looked as though he had not slept either. Papers were spread across the desk in front of him, along with 3 phones, 2 of which were ringing when I entered. "Elena," he said, without looking up. "You don't usually come to this part of the house." "I found something," I said, and I placed the note on the desk in front of him. He read it once, his face unreadable, and then read it again more slowly. When he finally looked up at me, something had changed behind his eyes, a sharpness that had not been there the day before, even in the ruins of his wedding. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "On my pillow. Someone left it for me directly, not for you." He was quiet for a long moment, turning the note over in his hands, as though the blank back of the page might reveal more than the words already had. "That means whoever wrote this either trusts you or wants to use you," he said finally. "Neither option is comfortable." I had not considered that. The idea that someone inside this house might be watching me closely enough to know I would bring the note straight to him sent a cold feeling through my chest. I glanced toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, though the hallway was empty. "Sit down," he said, and it was not a request in the way most of his sentences were not requests. But this time, there was something gentler underneath the command. I sat across from him, in a chair usually reserved for men who came to the house to discuss numbers I did not understand. "Tell me about yesterday," he said. "Not the note, before that, the dance." I blinked, surprised he wanted to return to that moment, given everything happening around us. "What is there to tell? You asked me to imagine the music, and I did." "You didn't have to offer," he said. "You could have left the room like everyone else." "I told you why I stayed." "You did," he said. "I've been thinking about it since. In 8 years, since the attack that put me in this chair, I have had exactly 1 person in this house treat me like something other than a title, or a liability. And it happened on the worst day of my life. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and he seemed to appreciate the silence more than he would have appreciated a response. He turned back to the note. I need to know who wrote this, and I need to know what happened to Camille, and right now, I have 20 men searching this estate and finding nothing, which means either they are looking in the wrong places, or someone inside this house is very good at hiding things. You think it's someone close to you, I said. I think it's someone close enough to leave a note on a maid's pillow without being seen or questioned, he said. That narrows the list considerably. Over the following hour, I watched Damien work in a way I had never seen before. He was not the quiet, controlled man from the chapel, nor the exhausted figure I had found alone among the wilted flowers. This was a different version of him entirely, sharp and methodical, moving through possibilities the way a surgeon moves through an operation, cutting away what did not matter until only the important pieces remained. He called in his head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Marco Bell, who had a scar along his jaw and eyes that moved constantly, checking corners and exits even indoors. Marco read the note without expression, and then looked at me with new interest. Where exactly was this left? Marco asked. On my pillow, in the staff quarters, sometime between the wedding and this morning, I said. The staff quarters have cameras only at the main entrance, Marco said, turning to Damien. Anyone with a staff badge could have walked in through the side corridor without being recorded, which means someone with legitimate access to this house, Damien said, not an outsider. I felt a chill settle over me at those words. The idea that someone I might pass in the hallway each day, someone who ate at the same staff table or nodded to me in the kitchen, could be involved in whatever had happened to Camille, made the whole house feel suddenly unfamiliar, full of shadows I had never bothered to notice before. I want a full list of everyone who had access to the staff quarters last night, Damien said. Compare it against everyone who left the wedding early. Cross-reference it with anyone who has had contact with Victor's people in the last month. Marco's eyebrows lifted slightly at the mention of Victor Hale's name, but he nodded and left without argument. When we were alone again, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since I first read the note. Do you think Camille left on her own, or was she taken? Damien rubbed a hand across his jaw, and for a moment the sharp, controlled version of him cracked just slightly, showing the tired man underneath. I don't know, he admitted. I barely knew her, Elena. Our families arranged this marriage 2 years ago, before I had ever spoken more than a dozen words to her. I respected her. I might have grown to care for her in time, but I cannot pretend this is the loss of a great love. What frightens me is what her disappearance means for the balance of power in this family, and what it might mean for her safety, whatever her reasons for leaving. I appreciated his honesty more than I expected to. It would have been easy for him to perform grief for my benefit, but he did not, and something about that honesty made me trust him more than I had before. You said this note narrows the list of suspects, I said. What happens now? Now, he said, you and I are going to figure out who in this house wants me to know something they are too afraid to say directly. I did not expect what came next. Instead of dismissing me back to my usual duties, Damien asked me to stay close over the following days, to keep my eyes open in places his security team could not easily reach: the kitchen, the laundry room, the quiet corners of the house where staff spoke freely because they assumed no one important was listening. He explained, carefully, that people in positions like mine often heard things that people in his position never would, simply because staff were treated as furniture, invisible and unimportant. It should have insulted me, that observation. Instead, it felt like the first time anyone in that house had acknowledged that my invisibility might actually be useful, rather than simply convenient for the people I served. Over the following 2 days, I moved through my usual routine with a new awareness, listening more closely to conversations I would normally have let pass by unnoticed. I heard 2 of the kitchen staff whispering about a car that had left the estate late on the night of the wedding, its headlights off as it moved down the service road that most guests never used. I heard a groundskeeper mention, almost in passing, that one of Victor Hale's men had been seen near the staff quarters earlier that same evening, though he had given no reason for being there. Each small piece of information felt insignificant on its own, But when I brought them to Damien each evening, sitting across from him in the same study where I had first shown him the note, I watched him assemble these fragments into something larger, something that pointed with growing certainty toward a conclusion neither of us wanted to say aloud. Victor Hale, his own uncle by marriage, the man who had walked to his side within minutes of Camille's absence being discovered, seemed to know more about that night than an innocent man should. "If it's him," Damien said quietly, on the second evening, staring at the notes we had gathered together on his desk, "then this was never about Camille at all. It was about making me look weak in front of 200 witnesses, on the day I was supposed to appear strongest." "Why would he want that?" I asked. Damien looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw real fear behind his composed expression. Not fear for himself, but fear of what a man willing to destroy a wedding to prove a point might be willing to do next. "Because a man in a wheelchair who cannot be humiliated in public is dangerous," he said. "But a man in a wheelchair who has just been humiliated in front of the entire family, on the day meant to secure his position, is an opportunity." The weight of that statement settled over the room, like the dust that had drifted through the golden light of the empty chapel, and I understood, in that moment, that whatever this had started as, it was no longer simply about a missing bride. It was about a war being fought quietly beneath the surface of a house I had once thought I understood completely, and somehow, without ever intending to, I had become part of it. "You should stop," Damien said suddenly, closing the folder of notes in front of him. "Tonight, whatever you've been doing, listening in the kitchen, watching the hallways, all of it, it needs to stop." I stared at him, confused by the sudden shift. "I thought you wanted my help." "I did. I do." He rubbed his temple, and for a moment the sharp strategist fell away entirely, leaving only a tired man who had lost a fiancé, a public image, and possibly the loyalty of his own family, within the space of 2 days. "But if Victor is willing to do this to secure power, he will not hesitate to remove anyone who threatens that plan, including a maid who happens to be gathering information for me. I will not have your safety on my conscience along with everything else." Something warm moved through my chest at his words, an unfamiliar feeling that I did not have a name for yet. In 2 years of service, no one in that house had ever expressed concern for my safety beyond making sure I did not damage expensive furniture while cleaning it. "With respect," I said carefully, "I don't think you get to decide that for me." He looked up, surprised, and I pressed on before I lost my nerve. "I have spent 2 years in this house being invisible. Nobody remembers my name at dinner parties. Nobody notices when I enter a room or when I leave it. You said yourself that this is useful, that people speak freely around me because they forget I exist. If that's true, then I am safer moving through this house than almost anyone else here, including you." He studied me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing my words against his instinct to protect the people around him, an instinct I suspected had been sharpened rather than dulled by 8 years of watching people either use him or underestimate him. "You're not wrong," he admitted finally, "but that doesn't mean I have to like it." "You don't have to like it," I agreed. "You only have to trust it." That seemed to settle something between us, and for the rest of that evening, we worked in a comfortable quiet, going over the fragments of information I had gathered, cross-referencing names and times, building a picture that grew clearer with every hour, though the shape of it grew more dangerous as well. Near midnight, when Marco Bell finally left after delivering a report on the movements of Victor's inner circle, Damien wheeled himself to the window and looked out over the dark grounds of the estate, the same grounds where, only 2 days earlier, 200 guests had gathered expecting to celebrate a wedding. "Can I ask you something?" he said, without turning around. "Of course. Why does none of this frighten you? A missing bride, a note left by an unknown hand, a possible conspiracy inside my own family. Most people would have quietly asked for a transfer to another household by now." I considered the question seriously before answering, because I owed him an honest answer, the same honesty he had given me about Camille. I think I spent so many years being told my place in the world was small, that I would never matter to anything important, that some part of me has been waiting for a chance to prove that wrong. I'm not brave exactly. I'm just tired of being invisible in a way that meant nothing. He turned his wheelchair slowly to face me, and in the dim light of the study, I saw something in his expression that I would spend the following days trying to understand. Something that looked almost like recognition, as though he had found, in this large and unfamiliar house, someone who understood a particular kind of loneliness that most people never had to learn. "You are not invisible to me," he said quietly, "not anymore." I did not know how to answer that, so I simply nodded, and we sat together in the quiet study, while, somewhere beyond the walls of that grand house, a war neither of us had chosen continued to gather its strength in the dark. Someone had gone through my room while I was serving breakfast, and the moment I stepped inside and saw my drawers left slightly open, I knew that whoever wanted to stop me had stopped waiting. Nothing had been taken. My small collection of belongings, a few photographs, a worn book, a handful of savings hidden in an old tin, all of it remained exactly where I had left it. That was almost worse than theft would have been. It meant this was not about money. It was a message. Someone wanted me to know they had been there, that they could reach me whenever they chose, in a room I had believed was the one private space left to me in that enormous house. I did not tell anyone at first. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my heart pounding, running through every conversation I had overheard in the past 2 days, wondering which one had reached the wrong ears. Eventually, I forced myself to breathe normally, straightened the drawers, and went to find Damien, because keeping this secret felt more dangerous than sharing it. He was in the garden that morning, an unusual choice for him, seated near the edge of the stone terrace, where the early light fell across the grounds. Marco Bell stood a short distance away, speaking quietly into a phone, his expression tense. "Someone searched my room," I said, before Damien could greet me. His head turned sharply. "When?" "While I was serving breakfast. Nothing was taken. They wanted me to know they were there." Marco ended his call immediately and crossed the terrace toward us. "That's not a warning from an outsider," he said. "That's someone with staff access, moving during daylight hours without drawing attention." Damien's jaw tightened, and I watched the same sharp, controlled anger I had seen in him during our late-night discussions settle over his face again. "Move her to the guest wing," he said to Marco. "Today. I don't care what explanation we give the rest of the staff." "Damien," I said, startled by the suddenness of the decision. "I don't need—" "You do," he said, and there was no room for argument in his voice. "If they searched your room once, they will do it again, and next time, it might not be an empty gesture." I wanted to protest further, to insist that I could take care of myself, but the memory of my open drawers and the cold feeling that had settled in my chest kept the words from coming. I nodded instead, and Marco left to arrange the move. Once we were alone, Damien wheeled closer to me, close enough that I could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the toll that 2 days of sleepless investigation had taken on him. "I should never have asked you to help with this," he said quietly. "I put you in danger without thinking it through." "You didn't ask me to search my own room," I said. "I offered to help, and I would offer again. This isn't your fault." "It feels like it is." "Then let it feel that way for a moment," I said, surprising myself with my own directness, "and then let it go, because dwelling on it will not help either of us find out who did this." He studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, the anger giving way to something quieter. "You have a way of saying exactly what I need to hear, even when I don't want to hear it." "Someone has to," I said, and for the first time since the wedding, I saw the faint suggestion of a real smile cross his face, brief and tired, but genuine. Over the following 2 days, the household shifted into a different rhythm. I moved into a small room in the guest wing, closer to Damien's study than the staff quarters had ever been, and though I told myself this was purely a matter of safety, some part of me noticed how easily I fell into the habit of finding reasons to pass by his study each evening, and how easily he found reasons to ask me to stay. We continued piecing together the fragments of the investigation. Marco's team had confirmed that the car seen leaving the estate on the night of the wedding belonged to a driver with loose connections to Victor Hale's household, though the trail went cold soon after, the vehicle abandoned 2 towns away, with no further sign of Camille. It was not proof, but it was enough to sharpen everyone's suspicion into something closer to certainty. On the 3rd night after my room had been searched, I overheard something that changed the shape of everything. I had gone down to the kitchen late, unable to sleep, hoping a cup of tea might settle the restless energy that had been building in me for days. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the small lamp above the stove, and I was reaching for the kettle when I heard voices in the pantry beyond, low and careful, clearly not meant to be overheard. I recognized one voice immediately. It belonged to Grace, one of the housekeepers, a quiet woman who had always kept to herself in the 2 years I had known her. The second voice was unfamiliar, male, with a coldness to it that made the hair on my arms rise before I had even understood the words. "The girl is asking too many questions," the man said. "Belle's people are getting close. You need to slow them down." "I've done what I can," Grace said, her voice tight with something that sounded like fear. "I never agreed to any of this beyond passing along a schedule. I didn't agree to be part of whatever happened to Camille." "You agreed the moment you took Victor's money," the man said. "There's no walking away now." I stood frozen by the stove, my hand still resting on the cold handle of the kettle, my heart pounding so loudly, I was certain they would hear it through the pantry door. I did not dare move, did not dare breathe too loudly. As the conversation continued in fragments, I struggled to piece together something about a location outside the city, something about needing more time before the next move could be made. When the footsteps finally retreated toward the back entrance, I waited a full 5 minutes before I trusted myself to move, and then I walked, as calmly as my shaking legs would allow, straight to Damien's study. He was still awake, unsurprisingly, papers spread across his desk, and a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. He looked up the moment I entered, and whatever he saw on my face made him set down the papers immediately. "What happened?" he said. I told him everything, word for word, as best I could remember it, and I watched his expression harden with every sentence. By the time I finished, he had already reached for one of his phones. "Grace," he said, almost to himself. "She's worked in this house for 6 years. She sounded afraid," I said. "I don't think she wanted any of this." "Fear doesn't undo what someone has already done," he said, though his voice carried less anger than I expected, more a kind of tired resignation. He made the call, and within minutes, Marco's voice came through on speaker, confirming that a team would move quietly to locate Grace, before she could be warned that her conversation had been overheard. "And the location she mentioned," "Location," Damien said into the phone. "Outside the city. I want it found tonight." I sat across from him, while the house around us slowly came alive with quiet, controlled activity, security teams moving through the halls with the kind of discipline that came from years of training rather than panic. I had never seen this side of the household before, the machinery beneath the polished surface of wealth and elegance, and I found myself both unsettled and, strangely, reassured by how carefully everything moved once the danger became clear. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Marco returned to the study, his expression grim. "We found the location," he said. "A property just outside the city, registered under a shell company we've linked to Victor before. Camille was there." Damien's whole body went still. Was. "She's alive," Marco said quickly, and I felt the tension in the room break slightly. "But she's been moved again in the last 12 hours, likely after your team started asking questions at the first location. We're still tracking the transfer." "And Grace?" Damien asked. "Detained, cooperating," Marco said. "She claims she only passed along schedules and access details, nothing more. She says she was afraid of what would happen to her family if she refused." I watched Damien absorb this information, his face a careful mask of control, though I had come to recognize the small signs beneath it, the tightness at the corner of his eyes, the way his hand curled slightly against the arm of his wheelchair. "Bring her to me," he said. "I want to hear it myself." While we waited for Grace to be brought in, Marco lingered near the door, clearly wanting to say something, but hesitant to speak freely in front of me. Damien noticed, and gave him a short nod, granting permission. "There's something else," Marco said. "One of the men we questioned near the first location mentioned a name we hadn't considered before. Daniel Price." Damien's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his usually controlled features. "Price handles logistics for the northern routes. He has no reason to be involved in something like this." "Unless someone offered him a reason," Marco said. "We're looking into his accounts now. If Victor has more than one person inside your organization, This could be bigger than we thought. I watched the two men exchange a look heavy with unspoken history, years of working together through crises I could not begin to imagine, and I understood, in that moment, just how fragile the structure of Damien's world truly was. From the outside, the Cross family had always seemed untouchable, a fortress of wealth and quiet power that nothing could shake. Standing in that study at 4 in the morning, listening to two exhausted men calculate how many traitors might be hiding within their own walls, I saw instead a structure held together by trust that could be bought, threatened, or broken with the right amount of pressure applied in the right place. "What do you need from me?" I asked, surprising myself with how naturally the question came. Damien turned to me, something like reluctance crossing his face before he answered. "Nothing tonight. You've already done more than I had any right to ask." He paused, then added, more quietly, "But if price is involved, and if there are others, I may need eyes in places my own men cannot easily reach without drawing attention. I hate asking this of you again." "You're not asking," I said. "I'm offering. There's a difference, remember." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, tired but real, and Marco looked between us with an expression I could not quite read, something between curiosity and quiet approval, before he excused himself to continue the search for Daniel Price's connections. Grace arrived 20 minutes later, escorted by two of Marco's men, her face pale and her hands trembling as she stood in the doorway of the study. I remained seated in the corner, uncertain whether I was meant to stay or leave, but Damien's brief glance toward me made it clear he wanted me there. "Tell me everything," Damien said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that filled the room without need for volume. Grace's story came out in halting pieces. Victor Hale had approached her nearly 3 months earlier, long before the wedding had even been announced publicly, offering money in exchange for small pieces of information, schedules, access codes, the layout of security patrols. She had told herself, at first, that it was harmless, the kind of minor betrayal that happened quietly in every large household without real consequence. By the time she understood what Victor actually intended, that Camille's disappearance had been planned from the very beginning as a way to weaken Damien's position within the family, she had already been in too deep to refuse without risking her own safety. "I didn't know he meant to take her," Grace said, tears slipping down her face. "I swear I didn't know it would go this far." "But you knew enough to keep quiet when it did," Damien said, and though his voice remained calm, the weight behind the words made Grace flinch. I felt an unexpected pull of sympathy for her, even knowing what she had done, because I recognized something of my own fear in her voice, the fear of a person with very little power caught between two forces far larger than herself. But sympathy did not erase the danger her silence had created, and I understood, watching Damien's face, that whatever happened next was no longer something I could soften or explain away. "You will tell my security team everything you know," Damien said. "Every detail, every contact, every location Victor has mentioned in your presence. In exchange, I will make certain no harm comes to you or your family." Grace nodded quickly, relief and shame mixing on her face in equal measure, and Marco led her away to begin a more thorough debriefing. When we were alone again, the study fell into a heavy silence. I could see the toll the night had taken on Damien, the exhaustion beneath his composed exterior, deepening with every hour that passed without Camille's safe return. "We're close," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "Closer than we've been since this started." "You'll find her," I said, and I meant it, though I understood there was little comfort I could offer beyond simple presence. He looked at me then, really looked, in a way that made my chest tighten with something I did not yet have the courage to name. "I don't think I would have gotten this close without you," he said. "You realize that, don't you? A note on your pillow, a conversation you happened to overhear in a kitchen at midnight. If you had simply gone to bed instead of making tea, none of this would have come to light tonight." "Then it's a good thing I couldn't sleep," I said, trying to lighten the weight of the moment, though something in his gaze told me he was not ready to let the moment pass so easily. "Elena," he said, and my name in his voice carried a gentleness I had not heard from him before, not even during our slow, imagined dance in the ruined chapel. "Whatever happens next, whatever this war with Victor becomes, I need you to know that what you've done these past few days, it isn't something I'll forget." I did not know how to respond to the sincerity in his voice, so I simply nodded, and outside the tall windows of the study, the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the estate. Before I left the study to try, uselessly, to catch an hour of sleep before the household woke fully, I paused at the door and looked back at him. He had already returned his attention to the papers on his desk, but there was a difference in the way he sat now, less like a man bracing against collapse, and more like a man preparing for a fight he intended to win. "Get some rest too," I said. "You won't be any use to Camille if you run yourself into the ground before we find her." "I'll rest when this is finished," he said, though the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, an acknowledgement that he had heard the concern beneath my words. I walked back through the quiet halls of the guest wing, past windows where the gray light was slowly turning gold, and I thought about how strange it was that a house so full of danger, secrets, and betrayal had also become, in the span of a few short days, the place where I finally felt like I mattered. It was a house that had not known peace since the morning of the wedding, and would not, I suspected, know peace again until this war beneath the surface finally came to its end. Gunfire shattered the quiet of the estate just after midnight, 3 sharp cracks that sent every bird in the garden scattering into the dark sky at once. I was in the hallway outside Damien's study when it happened, carrying a folder of information Marco had asked me to deliver, and for one frozen second I could not make sense of the sound, my mind refusing to accept what my body already understood. Then the second round of shots followed, closer this time, and I dropped to the floor on instinct, pressing myself against the cold marble, as shouting erupted throughout the house. Daniel Price had not been working alone. In the 2 days since Marco first uncovered his name, the investigation had moved quickly. Price's financial records showed regular payments from an account linked to Victor Hale, disguised through 3 separate shell companies, but knowing the truth and proving it publicly to the rest of the family council were 2 very different challenges. Damien had spent those 2 days building a case carefully, gathering evidence, preparing to expose Victor's betrayal in a way that would leave no room for denial or counterattack. Victor, it seemed, had decided not to wait and see whether that case would succeed. I heard Marco's voice shouting orders somewhere down the hall, and I forced myself to move, crawling along the wall toward the study where I knew Damien would still be, exactly where he always was during these long nights of planning and calculation. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, but underneath the fear was something else. A fierce, clear determination that pushed me forward instead of toward the nearest exit. The study door was ajar when I reached it, and I saw Damien near the window, his wheelchair positioned awkwardly against the desk, one hand braced against the wood as he tried to pull himself toward the small alcove, where I knew he kept a locked case of protective equipment for exactly this kind of emergency. His movements were slower than usual, hampered by the very disability that made him a target his enemies believed would be easy to eliminate. "Damien," I whispered, pushing the door open and crawling inside. "Get down, and stay away from the window," he said, his voice tight with urgency rather than panic. "Price's men are on the East Terrace. Security is engaging them now, but I don't know how many there are." I moved quickly to his side, staying low the way instinct told me to, and helped him pull himself the rest of the way toward the alcove. His hands were shaking, not from fear, I realized, but from frustration, the particular fury of a man who understood exactly what needed to be done and could not physically move fast enough to do it himself. "There," he said, nodding toward a small case built into the wall. "The code is 4719. My fingers fumbled with the lock twice before the case finally opened, revealing a compact defensive weapon and, more importantly, a small radio device that Damien grabbed immediately, switching it to a frequency that connected him directly to Marco's team. "Report," he said into the radio, his voice suddenly transformed into the sound of absolute command, all traces of the tired, grieving man from the wedding chapel gone entirely. Marco's voice crackled back, breathless. 3 shooters confirmed on the East Terrace, possibly more approaching from the service road. We're pushing them back, but they're better armed than we expected. "Price," Damien said. "Is he with them?" "No visual confirmation yet." "Find him," Damien said. "If Victor sent men to attack this house directly, Price is either leading them from somewhere close by, or he's already run, which means he knows something is about to break wide open. I crouched beside him, my back pressed against the cold stone wall beneath the window, listening to the exchange of gunfire outside grow more distant as Marco's security team pushed the attackers back toward the perimeter of the estate. Every instinct told me to stay perfectly still, to make myself as small and invisible as possible, until the danger passed, but I found myself watching Damien instead, the fierce concentration on his face as he coordinated a defense from a position on the floor of his own study, refusing to let his body's limitations slow the speed of his thinking even for a moment. A sudden crash of glass came from the hallway outside, followed by a shout and the heavy sound of a struggle. I froze, and Damien's hand shot out, gripping my arm tightly. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever happens, do not leave this room." "I'm not leaving you," I said. "Elena." His grip tightened, and for a moment the command in his voice cracked, revealing something underneath it, something closer to fear, though not for himself. "If someone comes through that door and it isn't Marco's team, I need you to be somewhere they won't look first, not sitting beside me like a target." I understood then that his concern was not about control or protocol. It was about me, specifically, in a way that made my chest ache even in the middle of the danger surrounding us. But I also understood, with sudden clarity, that I was not going to leave him alone and defenseless in a wheelchair while armed men moved through his house. "No," I said simply. He stared at me, frustration and something far softer warring in his expression. But before he could argue further, the study door burst open. It was not Marco. The man who stepped through the doorway was unfamiliar to me, tall and broad, a weapon raised and already sweeping the room. I did not think. I simply moved, grabbing the heavy brass lamp from the corner of the desk and throwing it as hard as I could toward him, the sudden motion enough to throw off his aim for the single second Damien needed. Damien's hand moved with surprising speed, the small defensive weapon from the case firing once, and the intruder staggered backward through the doorway, dropping his weapon as he fell against the hallway wall. Seconds later, two of Marco's men rushed past the open door, securing the fallen man and shouting confirmation into their radios that the immediate threat inside the house had been neutralized. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline that had carried me through the last several minutes, suddenly draining away and leaving me hollow and trembling in its wake. Damien reached for me, pulling me down beside him against the wall, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, simply breathing in the aftermath of violence that had come far too close. "You could have been killed," he said finally, his voice rough. "So could you," I said. "I wasn't going to let that happen while I was capable of stopping it." He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, stripped of all its usual composure and control, raw in a way that made my throat tighten. "Nobody has ever put themselves between me and danger before," he said quietly. "Not once. In 8 years of people either using me or protecting me, because it was their job." "Maybe that's the difference," I said, my voice unsteady, but certain. "I'm not doing this because it's my job." The gunfire outside had stopped entirely now, replaced by the sound of Marco's team securing the grounds, sweeping the estate for any remaining threats. Damien reached up and brushed a strand of hair away from my face, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than the gesture required, and I found myself leaning into the touch before I fully understood what I was doing. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I need to say something to you, and I want to say it properly, not in the middle of an attack on my own house." "I'll hold you to that," I said, and despite everything, despite the fear still coursing through my body and the danger that had not yet fully passed, I felt something steady and warm settle in my chest. It took another hour before Marco confirmed the estate had been fully secured. 2 of Price's men had been captured alive, 3 others had fled into the darkness beyond the property line, and Daniel Price himself, it turned out, had never set foot on the estate that night, watching the attack unfold from a safe distance, while his hired men took all the risk. "He's running," Marco reported, standing in the doorway of the study, his uniform torn at the shoulder, where a bullet had grazed close enough to tear fabric without breaking skin. "We tracked his phone to a private airstrip 20 minutes from here. If he gets on that plane, we lose him." Damien's expression hardened into something I had not seen from him before, a cold, focused determination that made it easy, suddenly, to understand exactly how a man in a wheelchair had managed to hold together a criminal empire for 8 years without ever losing his grip. "Don't let him get on that plane," Damien said. "And Marco, I want him alive. He knows exactly where Victor is holding Camille, and I intend to find out before this night is over." Marco nodded once and disappeared down the hallway, already relaying orders through his radio, and Damien turned back to me, the fierce determination in his face softening slightly as it settled on me. "This isn't over," he said, "but we're closer than we've ever been." The waiting stretched into the longest hour of my life. Staff moved cautiously through the halls, sweeping up broken glass and checking rooms for any sign of remaining danger, while Damien remained in the study, his radio open on the desk in front of him, listening to the clipped exchanges between Marco's team as they raced toward the airstrip. I sat beside him, no longer pretending I had anywhere else to be, and watched his face for every flicker of tension that crossed it whenever the radio crackled with new information. "They're closing the perimeter," a voice reported through the static. "2 vehicles blocking the runway access road. Price's car just came into view." Damien's hand tightened around mine, though his voice remained perfectly level when he responded. "Take him alive. I don't care what it costs." There was a pause, filled only with the distant sound of engines and shouting through the radio, long enough that I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. Then Marco's voice returned, breathless but triumphant. "We have him! Price is in custody!" No casualties on our side. The tension that had been coiled tightly through Damien's shoulders for the past hour finally released, and he let out a long breath, closing his eyes briefly before opening them again, sharp and focused once more. "Bring him to the house," he said. "I want to speak with him myself, tonight, before Victor has any chance to reach him first." It was nearly 4 in the morning when Daniel Price was brought into the study, his wrists bound, his usually composed appearance replaced by something far more desperate. He had always struck me, in the few times I had seen him around the estate, as a quiet, unremarkable man, the kind of person whose presence you forgot the moment he left a room. Seeing him now, pale and frightened in front of the man he had betrayed, it was difficult to imagine him orchestrating an attack that had nearly gotten Damien killed only hours earlier. "You have one chance to make this easier on yourself," Damien said, his voice cold and controlled in a way that made even me feel a chill, despite knowing the anger was not directed at me. "Tell me where Victor is holding Camille, and tell me now." Price's eyes darted toward the door, toward Marco standing guard beside it, and finally back to Damien, weighing whatever loyalty remained to Victor against the very real danger of the situation he now found himself in. "There's a property near the coast," Price said finally, his voice shaking. "Registered under a different shell company than the first location. Victor moved her there 2 nights ago, after your men found the first place too quickly." "Is she safe?" Damien asked, his voice sharpening. "As far as I know," Price said, "Victor needs her alive. Dead, she's worth nothing to his plan. Alive, she's leverage, proof that he can reach into your world and take what he wants without consequence." Damien's expression remained carefully controlled, but I could see the fury simmering just beneath the surface, barely contained by years of discipline. He turned to Marco. "Move on that location immediately. I want a full team there before sunrise." Marco nodded and left quickly, taking Price with him, and the study fell into a heavy, exhausted silence once the door closed behind them. "We're going to get her back," I said quietly. "I know," Damien said, though his voice carried more weariness than certainty, "but I keep thinking about how close this came to going differently tonight. If you hadn't thrown that lamp, if Marco's team had been 30 seconds slower, if Price had decided to lead the attack himself instead of hiding at a safe distance." He shook his head. "There are too many ways tonight could have ended badly." "But it didn't," I said. "We're both still here." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, the exhaustion giving way to a quiet, steady warmth that I had not seen from him before, not even during our slow dance in the ruined chapel. "Yes," he said softly, "we are." I nodded and reached for his hand without thinking, and he held it firmly. the two of us sitting together in the wreckage of a study that had nearly become a battlefield, waiting for the sun to rise over an estate finally quiet again, and for word from the coast that would tell us whether Camille had been found, and whether this long, dangerous night was finally drawing toward its end. The coastal house was still dark when Marco's team surrounded it just before sunrise, and I stood beside Damien in the back of a reinforced vehicle, parked a safe distance away, watching the operation unfold through a small monitor connected to the cameras his men wore. He had insisted on being present, despite Marco's objections, despite my own quiet worry after the attack on the estate only hours earlier. I understood why. This was not a decision he was willing to delegate to anyone else, not after everything that had led to this moment, not when the woman he had once agreed to marry, however complicated that arrangement had been, was somewhere inside that house, waiting to find out whether anyone was coming for her at all. Movement on the east side, a voice crackled through the radio. 2 guards, both armed. Damien's hand tightened on the armrest of his wheelchair, and I resisted the urge to reach for him, understanding that he needed his full concentration for what was happening, not comfort that would only distract him. The next several minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by clipped updates from Marco's team as they moved through the property with practiced precision. I watched the small screen with my heart in my throat, catching glimpses of dim hallways, closed doors, shadows moving with careful purpose through a house that held no idea of the danger closing in around it. "We have her," Marco's voice finally came through, and the relief in his tone was unmistakable even through the static. "Camille is alive. She's shaken, but unharmed. We're bringing her out now." The breath left Damien's body all at once, and for a moment he simply sat there, his eyes closed, his hands still gripping the armrest tightly. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet, though he blinked the moisture away quickly before it could fall. "Thank you," he said quietly, and I understood the words were not meant only for Marco, but for everyone who had played a part in bringing this long, dangerous chase to its end, myself included. Camille emerged from the house 10 minutes later, wrapped in a blanket one of Marco's team had given her face pale and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. Damien wheeled himself forward to meet her as she approached the vehicle, and I stayed back, giving them the space this reunion deserved, though I watched closely, curious and, if I am honest with myself, a little nervous about what this moment might mean for whatever had begun to grow between Damien and me over the past several days. "I'm sorry," Camille said, her voice cracking as she stood in front of him. "Victor came to me the week before the wedding. He told me if I didn't disappear on my own, he would make sure something happened to my family instead. I didn't know what else to do." Damien's expression softened into something I had not expected, understanding rather than anger. "You should have come to me." "I was afraid," Camille said. "I didn't know who I could trust in that house anymore." "I understand," Damien said, and he reached out to take her hand briefly, a gesture of genuine kindness rather than romantic affection, and something in the careful distance of that touch told me everything I needed to know about where his heart actually stood, even before he spoke again. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Camille nodded, tears slipping down her face, and Marco gently guided her toward a second vehicle, where medical staff waited to examine her before the drive back to the estate. As she passed me, she paused for a brief moment, studying my face with quiet curiosity, as though she recognized something in the way Damien had glanced toward me only seconds before. "Thank you," she said simply, "for whatever you did to help find me." And then she was gone, leaving me standing beside Damien in the pale morning light, both of us finally allowing ourselves to feel the exhaustion of the past several days settle fully into our bodies. The following weeks moved quickly, though every day carried its own weight of consequence. Victor Hale was found within 3 days, attempting to cross the northern border with a small group of loyal men, and the confrontation that followed was resolved without further violence, largely because Damien had spent those 3 days carefully building a case so thorough, so undeniable, that even Victor's remaining allies within the family council abandoned him rather than risk being associated with his downfall. I was not present for the formal council meeting where Victor's fate within the family was decided, but Damien told me afterward, in the quiet of his study one evening, that it had been the first time in 8 years he had walked into that room, so to speak, with absolute certainty of his authority, unquestioned by anyone present. They saw a man who survived an attack on his own house and still found the strength to bring the person responsible to justice. He said, "Nobody in that room is going to underestimate me again." "Good," I said. "They shouldn't have in the first place." He smiled at that, a real smile, warm and unguarded in a way I had rarely seen from him before all of this began. "You never did," he said, "underestimate me, I mean. Not once, from the very first day I met you." "I never had a reason to," I said honestly. "I saw how you ran this house long before any of this happened. I just don't think anyone ever bothered to ask what I noticed." Grace, in the end, was allowed to keep her position within the household, though under closer watch, and with a formal warning that made clear how narrowly she had avoided far more serious consequences. Daniel Price was not so fortunate, though the details of what became of him were never something Damien discussed with me directly, and I understood, by then, that there were parts of his world I did not need or want to know in full detail. I had learned enough about the shape of his life to understand that some things existed in shadows I was not meant to illuminate, and I had made my peace with that boundary, trusting that the man I had come to know would handle those matters with whatever justice he believed was fair. Camille, once she had recovered from the ordeal, made a decision that surprised no one who had watched the aftermath unfold. She asked to be released from the marriage arrangement entirely, explaining gently to Damien that whatever bond might have grown between them under different circumstances had been undermined too deeply by fear and betrayal to ever recover into something genuine. Damien agreed without hesitation, and the two parted on terms that, while not close, carried a mutual respect neither of them had expected to find on the other side of such a difficult chapter. In the days following Camille's rescue, the estate slowly began to breathe again, the tension that had gripped every hallway and every quiet corner easing, bit by bit, as the household settled into a new, steadier rhythm. I returned to some of my old duties at first, though Damien insisted, gently but firmly, that I no longer needed to carry trays or press linens, an offer I initially resisted out of habit and pride, uncertain of what my place in that house was meant to be, now that the danger had passed, and the strange, urgent partnership between us no longer had a crisis to justify it. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he told me one evening, as we sat together in the garden, where I had first learned about the attack on my room weeks earlier, the air warm and fragrant with the last of the summer flowers. "I only want you to know that whatever you choose, staying in this house should never again feel like an obligation. And if I don't know what I want," I admitted, "beyond the fact that I don't want to leave." He reached for my hand across the small space between our chairs, his fingers warm and steady around mine. "Then stay, and let's figure the rest out together, without any war forcing our hand this time." Those weeks became, in many ways, the gentlest and most surprising of my entire life. Without the constant shadow of danger hanging over the estate, I discovered a version of Damien I had only glimpsed in fragments during the crisis. A man with a dry sense of humor he rarely let anyone see, a genuine curiosity about the small details of my life before I had ever come to work in his house, patient in a way that made the years of guarded control he usually wore in front of others seem almost like a different person entirely. We spent evenings in the study that had once been the center of our desperate investigation, though now the papers spread across the desk were just as likely to be books we were reading together, or plans for small changes to the garden, as anything related to business. He taught me how to play chess, badly at first, though I improved quickly enough to make our matches genuinely competitive within a month, and I taught him, in turn, some of the simple songs my mother used to hum while she worked, filling the quiet hours of the house with music that had nothing to do with grand orchestras or wedding bands, only the two of us, and whatever melody came easiest. Marco, who had grown fond of me during the investigation in his own gruff, protective way, took to teasing Damien gently whenever he caught the two of us together, though it was clear from the warmth in his eyes that he approved of whatever had grown between his employer and the household maid who had once thrown a lamp at an armed intruder without a moment's hesitation. "Never seen him laugh this much," Marco told me once, when Damien had left the room briefly to take a call. "Not in all the years I've worked for this family." I did not know how to answer that, so I only smiled, carrying the words with me long after Marco had gone back to his duties, turning them over quietly in my mind, the way you hold on to something precious you are not yet ready to name. It was nearly 2 months after the wedding that never happened, that I found myself once again standing at the entrance of that same chapel. Though this time, the flowers along the altar were fresh, white roses arranged with careful precision, and the chairs held only a small gathering, no more than 30 people, a stark contrast to the 200 guests who had once filled this room, expecting a very different kind of celebration. I stood near the back, dressed not in my usual staff uniform but in a simple dress I had chosen myself, uncertain until the very last moment whether I truly belonged among the guests rather than serving them, when Damien's voice reached me from the front of the chapel. "Elena," he said, and every head in the room turned toward me. "Would you come here, please?" My heart pounded as I walked down the same aisle I had once cleared of abandoned chairs and wilted flowers, though this time the path was lined with the quiet, warm attention of people who had come specifically to witness whatever was about to happen. Damien waited for me at the front, his wheelchair positioned exactly where it had been on that first terrible day, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "2 months ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel, "I sat in this exact spot, waiting for a wedding that was never going to happen, surrounded by 200 people who left the moment things became difficult. Every single one of them, except for a woman who had no reason to stay, who owed me nothing beyond the basic requirements of her job, and who chose, without being asked, to keep me company in the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of my life." I felt tears gathering in my eyes as he spoke, the small gathering around us fading into a soft blur of warmth and attention. "In the weeks since then," he continued, "that same woman helped uncover a conspiracy that nearly destroyed my family. She stood between me and an armed attacker without a moment's hesitation. She reminded me, more times than I can count, that I was still a person worth caring for, even at my lowest and most humiliated moment. I have spent 8 years believing that my condition made certain kinds of love impossible for me to expect from anyone. Elena, you proved me wrong every single day since that first dance." He reached into his jacket and produced a small box, and I felt my breath catch entirely as he opened it, revealing a simple ring that caught the light streaming through the tall chapel windows. "I am not asking you this because of gratitude, or obligation, or because it would be convenient," he said. "I am asking because somewhere between that first impossible dance and this very moment, I fell in love with you, completely and without reservation, and I would like, very much, to spend whatever years I have left, proving that I am worthy of everything you have already given me. Elena, will you marry me?" The chapel had gone completely silent, 30 pairs of eyes watching, waiting, though in that moment, it felt as though only the two of us existed in that vast stone room. I thought about the first time I had walked down this aisle, past abandoned chairs and wilted flowers, offering nothing more than company to a man the world had already decided to pity. I thought about every quiet evening in his study since then, every dangerous night, every moment we had built together, piece by piece, into something neither of us had expected to find. "Yes," I said, my voice breaking with the weight of everything that word carried. "Yes, of course, yes." The small gathering erupted into applause and warm laughter as Damien slid the ring onto my finger, his hands steady despite the emotion clearly written across his face, and when he pulled me down toward him, I met him halfway, kneeling beside his wheelchair so that our faces were level, and he kissed me there in front of everyone, in the same chapel where he had once sat entirely alone. Later that evening, after the small gathering had shared a quiet celebration dinner and slowly departed, leaving the two of us alone in the same grand hall where this entire story had begun, Damien wheeled himself toward the center of the room, where the flowers still stood fresh along the altar, and he looked up at me with a familiar warmth in his eyes. "There's no band tonight either," he said. I smiled, understanding immediately, and I began to hum the same soft tune I had hummed on that very first afternoon, guiding his wheelchair in slow, gentle turns across the polished marble floor, beneath the same tall windows where golden evening light poured in, exactly as it had 2 months before. "Shall we dance?" I asked, though this time it was not a question offered out of pity or kindness to a stranger in pain, but a promise between two people who had found, in each other, exactly what they had never known they were searching for. Always, he said, and we moved together through the quiet chapel, no longer strangers bound by circumstance, but two people who had chosen each other freely, in the middle of chaos and danger, and everything the world had thrown against them, and had come out the other side, finally, home.